Hello everybody and welcome to day 9 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. We're on the third and final day of discovering discovered attack, and in this video I'm going to give you two test positions as kind of a final test to not only apply your thought process but to also see how you would set up or you'd take a tactical pattern and you'd use that understanding of the pattern to set it up in your own games. So this position is white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, let's get into it. So for white to move, you would look for ways to set up a discovered attack, but you also want to keep in mind your opponent's forcing replies. When you go to set up kind of a tactical pattern in a game, it's never as simple as it appears because your opponent has equal say in the game, and there's a lot of forcing moves they can make as well. So there's multiple moves, something like bishop to g3, just threatening checkmate in one, which actually looks like black can't defend. Bishop to h3, and those are the main candidates you look at. Now, bishop to h3, it looks like it just gives away a rook, but notice it also sets up a discovery along this diagonal. So those would be your two forcing candidates. Now, luckily, black is pretty passive with the rook and the knight sitting here, and he is surrounded by, his king is surrounded by black's pieces, but white has a lot of threatening options. Now, the thing that you should notice in this position is black has his own discovery that he's threatening with this rook along the e-file. So when you see these kind of pieces lined up, especially when they're lined up against your king, you should always look at forcing replies by your opponent. Now let's look at bishop to g3, just going for a simple checkmate in one. You should notice that the discovered attack, also a double check, a double threat, wins the queen because the rook is threatening, and he's just going to take your queen and win the game. So you can discount bishop to g3 right away. Now, you might think to just move the king and then resume whatever you're going to do, but you should always look for forcing replies. So we would look at bishop to h3, threatening a discovery. Now, it looks like he still has that same check, but you would look at the reply king to d3, and now actually you have a discovered attack against the queen still, and now you're threatening bishop takes f5 and a quick mate for white. So that would be losing for black. Now, what about queen takes the rook? You'd definitely have to look at that. Well, you do have a discovery, but you'd have to see still knight to f5, and now if the king moves, namely to something like, well, I guess d2 would be the only move, then the queen can actually come here to f3, threaten this bishop, and also protect the knight. Actually, in this position, it would be losing for white, so you'd have to go earlier in your calculations. Now, the only move, because the rook is threatening, along with the queen, this knight, you'd have to respond to that. The only move would be bishop takes, and after queen takes, and you go bishop to g3, then the queen will be able to come back and stop your mate threat, and you're just down too much material. So sometimes when you set up a discovered attack, you're actually not going to make that. You'll actually defend first before you do that. So in this position, the king goes to d2. Very nice. Actually, he just steps out of the way of black's own discovered attack on the e-file. And now he has two threats. He has bishop to g3, and then he actually does have this discovery now. And that sudden knight to f5 doesn't work because there's no check. So the queen would either take here, and then the queen just takes, or the queen could go to f3, but after bishop to g3, it's basically all over. There's no way to defend against the mate on c7. The queen would just have to take, and there's nothing else here. So he could take, you take here, and then you just win the queen. Now there was one more variation I wanted to note in this position. So after king to d2, the queen could come to f3, and if you play bishop to g3, you should also note the forcing variation of queen takes on e2. Now if the king takes, notice that he's kind of decoying the king back to the e-file, and now black actually does have knight takes f5. But of course, because the bishop is pinning it, all the king has to do is just go here, and the rook can come here trying to protect against the mate on c7, but you just take, And then you don't even have to take that rook. You just go queen to c7 because the rook is pinned. Very nice variation as well that you have to see in order to defend properly. In position 2, it's white to move, and you can pause the video now. So in this position, it's actually a similar idea in terms of using discovered attack or the theme to set it up instead of noticing it in the position and applying it. Now there's quite a lot of moves. It looks like black is trying to defend against the mating net against his king, and this knight on e4 is rather annoying because white has some checks here, and it looks like he could potentially achieve mate through some forcing moves, but of course black defends well enough with the bishop and the knight covering important squares. The knight is threatening the bishop on d2, which would support a check, namely on g5 or on f6, and white has some forcing moves, but they don't necessarily work right now. So you can take that idea and set up a discovery. Now this bishop, you notice that it's actually not active at all. It's basically just defending pawns, and white has the idea to reactivate that bishop, bring the last piece into the attack, and that's a point I want to make in position 2. When you're playing a game and you've started an attack and it's not quite successful, you have a lot of activity, what you should focus on is how to bring an inactive piece into the attack, because a lot of times that will kind of push the attack over the edge where your opponent can't defend all the threats suddenly. And in this position, that's exactly what happens. So bishop to d3. And now all of a sudden, black has to defend against this last piece. And notice that if the knight takes on d2, suddenly you have this discovery against the king. And it's actually a mate in 2 if you want to calculate it from this position. All right, so the mate in 2 would start with rook to e5, and that's a discovery against the king. The knight is covering the g7 square, the rook is covering f7. And if the knight comes here, then actually you could just go to rook to f6 checkmate, and the knight is pinned. And if he didn't interpose, if he just went here, then you'd still get a checkmate. Notice that the rook is covering the knight on h5. So you could use a basic 2-move mate to see that if black takes that bishop on d2, then the discovered attack is too strong. So what else could black do? Well, in this position, the best defense would actually be h6, and white has multiple moves at this point, but basically rook to f6, and now he goes back. Notice that the bishop is protecting on h6, so you could take. And now actually white has multiple options. He could just simply take the bishop, and then you get this check, take, and then basically you could evaluate that white has 3 pawns plus. It is a bishop of opposite color ending, but 3 pawns up is just too much. Now a more accurate way would actually be, instead of just taking, you could play rook to g6 check. He comes over, and now you take, and then you actually get 2 minor pieces for a rook. A clearly winning endgame, +7. So essentially from the beginning of this position, white used a setup of a discovery to essentially win material. He didn't necessarily get a mating net and a mate against the black king, but bringing that last piece into the game led to a 1 material position. Tomorrow we are going to get in day 10 into decoy, and we'll go from there over the next 3 days covering decoy. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.